Welcome back to Troubleshooting Agile. Hi there, Jeffrey.
Hi, Squirrel. So, Squirrel, you were telling me a story about the classic recipe of disagree and commit, which has two ingredients, and you encountered a place where people felt they were making that, but they left out one of the important ingredients rather, which is they forgot the disagreement. How does that happen? Tell us about that story.
Sure. So I have someone I've worked with many times and give a lot of advice to, and he phoned me up as he often does, and he said, "Squirrel, everything's terrible. I'm having a terrible disagreement. My boss has told me to disagree and commit, and I think it's awful. What should I do?" And I had him tell me a little bit about what he'd done, and I said, "You forgot something important. You forgot to disagree." And the problem when you forget to disagree is that you don't get the benefit of this practice, which can be very good, of disagree and commit. And he said, "But Squirrel, I'm telling you I disagree." And I said, "Yeah, but nobody's heard about it."
Yeah.
And so what he had done is he'd received a decision, a direction, some information from his boss, and he had interpreted that as a closed issue, as something that was not to be discussed further, and that he was supposed to, as the company's culture and sort of approach dictates, that he was supposed to disagree and commit. And the problem is that he hadn't told his boss about what his disagreements were and why he had them. And when I've seen people use disagree and commit successfully, there's a big period of disagreement. There's some activity that happens that's called the disagreement. And
Yeah.
then at some point, there's an agreement that there's a disagreement. And there's somebody who says, "Okay, I'm going to commit even though I disagree." He hadn't done any of that.
Right.
And that's what I thought our listeners might benefit from is sort of avoiding the negative possibilities here. There are two of them, and sort of steering down the middle to get the good outcome. What do you think?
Yeah, which is exactly why I want to talk about this because people forget what disagree and commit is, what it exists for, what it's supposed to solve, and people often misinterpret it in the way that it seems like your client did. And so I thought it was definitely worth talking about it, about the both failure modes. But let's start with the one that happened, because I think there is definitely a common misunderstanding that disagree and commit means essentially top-down control. And people might say it, and I've heard bosses sometimes say this and say, "Look, here's my decision. You just need to disagree and commit." And by saying that, what they're meaning is, just shut up and do what I say. Um, Now, that might be very attractive as a phrase, and I can understand why a boss would think that that's what disagree and commit means, but they're getting it entirely wrong, right? And I think that's the key thing here is that the ability to commit um, only comes after someone has been able to voice their disagreement. And if people aren't allowed to voice their disagreement, then they don't have the ability to then go forward. But I've seen many times when people have been able to voice their disagreement, they're then able to commit. That the key thing is that they feel heard, that they know that their objections have been heard and considered. But they're not necessarily asking for everyone to agree with them, but rather for at least their concerns to be considered. And that always has been,
And
to
Jeffrey,
me,
I'd go
the
beyond
key
that.
move. Yeah,
So
oh, really?
I think I disagree with you because
Okay.
I think absolutely everything you said is true, but I think there's more and it's important. And the first thing is, if the boss really means shut up and commit, then he or she should just say that. And there are cases in which that makes sense, right? If you're running away from a burning building, it would be good if you shut up and commit to the exit sign rather than having a discussion about which exit you should take.
Yes.
So that's a case where being clear and just saying shut up and commit would work better. But also, it's not simply that people feel heard and that they are able to commit. I think those are exactly valid comments. Those are useful phrases. But also, if you are disagreeing and committing, You are adding to the conversation in a valuable way. You're adding a perspective that may not have been present before, and that might actually change the decision. You might still
Yes.
commit to something you disagree with, but it might be a different thing.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think that gets into the heart of why disagreeing commit is so valuable. Is both parts of it. And the first part is, as you say, the disagreement can actually surface information. And that's why when I think about what this is trying to solve, one of the first thing it's trying to solve is the idea that a single person, usually the boss or the highest paid person, should be making all the decisions. And only their knowledge base is being consulted. So one way that I've seen that the one failure mode I've seen that disagreeing commit is designed in my minds to counteract is a team of people who are fairly passive with a strong team lead or technical lead making all the decisions, and often all the parties are unhappy. The team are unhappy because they don't agree with everything that's being decided, but also the team lead feels unhappy because why are they making all the decisions? How come no one else is helping out? How come no one else chips in? They would actually like people's input, and they feel a lot of a burden of pressure on them, but they feel like they're alone and unsupported. And I think that's a failure mode that can happen, and is very different from what you were describing, where there is a case where someone is making a decision they feel is time sensitive and they don't have time to discuss. In that, shut up and commit. That if that's what you mean, then I agree. Say it. And in either case here, there's that scenario of I actually do mean to be making all the decisions is different one where people just assume that the leader is making a decision and doesn't want that sort of an implied or assumed rather uh, feeling that what the leader wants is people to shut up. But they don't test that. People don't test that, and then both sides end up unhappy. So that's a common failure mode I've seen on teams. I don't know if you've seen it as much as I have.
Oh, I've seen it hundreds of times, and it's even worse because not only do the people feel unhappy, but the business makes stupid decisions
Right.
because the boss is often existing in a kind of a boss bubble and has a certain limited amount of information. Often it's out of date, and somebody who's at the coalface who went to see the customer yesterday who received the angry phone call that triggered whatever the action was, that person has information. And what you don't want to do by any means, just because that person disagrees with you, is to miss out on getting the information that he or she has. Even if you still disagree after you finish getting the information, have the disagreement because not only will you help people to feel more motivated and more positive about whatever the decision is, you will also incorporate information that you otherwise didn't have.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the value add. Now the disagree and commit, we've covered here the value of the disagree part is surfacing more information. And the key idea is to improve the decision that's being made by surfacing more information. But I think it's also worth discussing the failure mode that leads to the other side, which is the commit side, um, which is it can also happen in places where people do have a good culture of sharing relevant information that sometimes people don't know when to stop. That actually, that people have shared all relevant information and a decision has been made, but one or more people still feel partisan feelings towards their position, which is different from everyone else's. And it can definitely have a place where uh, people have the misunderstanding that actually if we all share relevant information, well, then we'll all agree. And any disagreement is a failure to communicate. And so therefore we should continue the communication until agreement is reached.
That is the way to the path to perdition. You're headed for
Yes.
purgatory. That's no fun. That's the endless meeting end game. Please, please, listeners, don't head for the endless meeting pit of despair.
Yes, and I think that I'm going to guess this is a more modern management style failure mode. And there's a kind of I've already said the hope behind it, which is once we all have the same information, of course we'll all think the same thing. But that is is an assumption that makes deep violence about the lack of individuality from person to person. That actually we all have different values, and given the same information, can make different decisions from a very genuine and sincere place. And it's a mistake to think that just because people have the same information, they will agree on any particular thing. Um, and therefore, that belief that we need to come to consensus and we all will think alike, I think that's just too high of a burden. We are not clones of one another. We are not social insects where such a state might be possible. But I think that's the other failure mode that disagree and commit is supposed to get to, which is at some point we've surfaced all the relevant information. We've successfully done the disagreement, and now we need to have a decision-making process and commit to that decision, even if it's not the one that person B really particularly would like. They need to be willing to support the decision of the group rather than continuing to hold a flame for what they thought was the better decision.
Or, of course, it's perfectly fine for them to leave the group or to take another action that causes them not to participate. But continuing to have the discussion, I can say this having been a long-haired, card-carrying hippie at some point in my life. That's the mistake you make when you just kind of sit around and sing "Kumbaya" all day and think, hey, the world's going to be a great place once we all talk to each other. If that were true, or if any listeners think that's true and can prove it, I'd be very interested. But
Yeah.
my experience is that there are going to be real disagreements. They are valuable, and it's worth discussing them to a point. And then when it becomes clear you've got a hung jury, I was on one of those too. There's no point in deliberating further. It's better to decide to disagree and commit, or leave the group, or not do anything and wait. Any of those would be better than continued discussion. And I think all our listeners will have been in situations where the discussion had gone on much longer than it should have.
So, no, so there's a key thing here then, which we're kind of talking about in these two failure modes, which is both what is sort of necessary in the disagreement, and on the other hand, what is sufficient in the disagreement. And there's how do you know when you should stop the disagreement? And I would say this is actually a bit of a skill, and something that is what makes the disagreeing commit worth. But it's something that people need to learn. So I think it'd be worth talking a bit further about what makes a good disagreement. What do you think?
I agree completely, but I think we should do that next week because we're running up against our typical time. So, Jeffrey, unless you disagree, I'm going to ask you to commit to talking about this next week. What do you think?
I'd be quite happy to do so. I will commit to that, Squirrel.
Excellent. Well, if listeners would like to commit to a different point of view and they'd like to commit that to paper and commit that to the post office, we'd sure like to hear from you. You don't have to use a postage stamp, though. We get email and Instagram and OpenClaw and whatever else is out there. The way to find all of those different ways to get in touch with us is to go to agileconversations.com, where you will find our book. I just had to order new copies because I've been handing out so many. So there's our book, Agile Conversations. There's free information on running a conversational dojo so you can practice disagreeing, and lots of other free stuff. And of course, other than disagreeing with us now, you can wait till next week and disagree with us then, because we'll be back then with another edition of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.